Hey friends, the Laravel service container helps us manage dependencies and perform dependency injection in our applications. It's simple yet powerful, and it has great documentation. I am Mohammed Saeed, and in this video I'm going to share with you 5 tips that you can use when dealing with the dependency injection container or the service container in your Laravel applications. The first thing that I want to share with you today is that you should never run any database queries inside your service providers. And the reason for that is the service providers are all executed, the register method and the put method of the service providers are executed while the application is booting up. And in some cases you might want to put the application or run the Laravel application before even having the environment file configured on the machine. Like when the Composer dependencies are installed via the Composer install command and the post autoload dump script is executed. When this script is executed by Composer, the PHP artisan package discover command will run. This command will put an application instance to locate and register packages, service providers, and container aliases. If you are executing database queries in your service providers, running Composer install will fail while installing your application on a deployment platform like Laravel Forge. And that's because there is no environment file yet ready for the application to read the database credentials from, and so the database queries will fail because it cannot connect to the database. Same goes for interacting with Redis, and same goes for interacting with any service that requires reading credentials from your environment file. So make sure not to execute any code inside your service providers that rely on reading data from the environment file. The second thing that I have for you today is to never resolve services inside the register method of a service provider. And the reason for that is while the application is booting, the register methods of all service providers are executed first, and then the put methods of all service providers. So inside the register method, there is no guarantee that a service has already been registered in the container, because not all providers were registered yet. So don't attempt to resolve anything from the container inside the register method of a service provider. Instead, move your code inside the put method. By the time the put method runs, all services should be registered already in the container, because registering services happens inside the register method, and the register method of all service providers will be executed first before executing any put methods of any service provider, as we mentioned earlier. The third tip that I have for you today is to never use the sessions or read data from the session inside a service provider. And the reason for that is that session data will not be available to the application while booting up. It will only be available after the start session middleware runs, and that's at a later stage. So any code inside a service provider that interacts with the session will not run successfully because there is no session data yet. Instead, move that code to a middleware, and by the time this middleware runs, the start session middleware will be executed, will be already ran, and the session data will be available for you. The fourth tip that I have for you today is to use scooped instances instead of singletons if you need a fresh state. And the reason for that is that singletons will live inside the Laravel container as long as the container instance is there. And in the case of Laravel Octane, and while processing jobs via a Laravel worker, a queue jobs, the container will live throughout the lifetime of the worker. And that means any singletons that you register inside the container will be used with each request inside Octane and with each job being processed by a queue worker. If you want each Octane request or each job being processed by a Laravel worker to receive a fresh instance from the service that you declared as a singleton, don't declare it as a singleton and declare it as a scooped instance instead. Here in the app service provider, I am registering a service called service as a singleton inside the Laravel container, and because it's registered as a singleton, it will live throughout the lifetime of the container. I don't want that, and for that reason I'm going to switch to using the scoped instances. Scoped instances will be resolved once while handling each Octane request or queue job, and will be flushed from the container before handling the next Octane request or queue job, giving it a fresh state each time. So next time you are registering a singleton inside the container for a package or for your application, think about this difference between a singleton and a scoped instance and choose the one that works for your use case. The fifth and final tip that I want to share with you today is to listen to the rebind events that are fired by the container to refresh dependencies. So whenever an instance is replaced in the container, a rebinding event is fired by the container. If you listen to this rebinding event, you can refresh this instance inside any other service that uses it as a dependency. This is quite confusing, so let's take a look at an example to understand it better. This service here registered in the container as a singleton relies on the current tenant using the application. The tenant is a registered instance in the container, and it changes with every new Octane request or queue job. While resolving this service, we pass the instance of the current tenant to it so it can be used while using the service. And since this service here relies on the tenant, we need to give it the new tenant instance each time it's rebound to the container with every new Octane request or every new queue job. And to do that, we are going to use the rebinding method. So here, after setting the current tenant, we are going to use the instance of the container passed to the closure here and call the rebinding method. We want to listen to the rebinding event when the tenant instance changes. And here is what we are going to do when that happens. We'll pass a closure. This closure accepts an instance of the container and an instance or the fresh instance of the service that we want to listen to the rebinding event for, which is the tenant service. What we want to do is that each time the tenant service is rebound to the container, we want to set the new instance, or we want to pass it to our service so it uses the latest instance that was registered inside the container. So here we call service set tenant and then pass the tenant. Now when this singleton is resolved the first time, it will receive the latest instance of the tenant registered in the container. And whenever the tenant changes, by rebinding it to the container, the service will also receive the new tenant because we have this as a rebinding event. And instead of calling the rebinding method, there is a really good trick that we can use using the refresh method. The refresh method accepts the name of the service that we want to listen to the rebinding event for, which in our case is the tenant service. And instead of passing a closure, we're going to pass the service or the target service that we want to refresh, and we are going to call the method or pass the name of the method that we want to call on that target. In that case, it's set tenant. And now we can get rid of this. With the refresh method, anytime the tenant service changes, the container is going to call the set tenant method on the service and pass the new tenant instance to it, which is what we want. And that's it for this episode. I hope you learned something. If you have any questions or if you have any comments, please leave them in the comments section down below and I will do my best to answer all the questions. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you get notified whenever we post a new video. So have a good day, happy coding, and see you later.